Welcome to Still Unanswered. I'm Megan Hollis. Today, we're returning to a case that has haunted Southern Illinois for decades: the brutal, unresolved murders of the Dardeen family in November 1987. It's a story that sits at the intersection of small-town faith, growing fear, and a violence that makes almost no sense. We'll walk the timeline, examine the evidence, and talk about the man who later confessed, Tommy Lynn Sells, and why his multiple, conflicting accounts still leave us with more questions than answers.
Thanks, Megan. I'm Aaron Kessler. I study the psychology of family annihilations and transient offenders from that era. This case it's painful on a lot of levels. Not just because of the brutality, but because of the uncertainties. We have a family that, on paper, looked ordinary and stable, and yet, well, the violence was extreme, and the motive remains murky.
Right. And before we get into the gruesome details, I want to set the scene. Ena, Illinois, tiny, rural Jefferson County, along Route 37 near Rend Lake. If you know the region, you know it's the kind of place where people go to church, they know each other by name, and they expect a level of safety that's tied to familiarity. In the mid-1980s, though, that feeling was fraying.
There had been a spike in violent crime in the area. The records and local reporting from the time note at least 10 to 15 homicides in the 2 years leading up to the Dardeen murders. That's a lot for a rural county. Add to that a shocking murder of a 10-year-old in May 1987 and a nearby familicide in Mount Vernon in '85, and people weren't just worried, they were on edge.
Yeah. I've reported in communities exactly like Ena, a lot of them in southern Indiana and across the Midwest. And I can tell you, fear spreads fast in places where people are used to being able to leave a door unlocked. After a string of violent incidents, some residents literally started sleeping with guns. Rumors started too. This was the height of the so-called satanic panic, so you had both true worry and a lot of speculation about dark, organized conspiracies that weren't supported by evidence.
That's important context. It changes how people react to a crime like the Dardeen murders when it happens. Makes the shock and the need for answers almost unbearable.
Let's introduce the family. Russell Keith Dardeen, he went by Keith, was 29. His wife, Ruby Elaine Dardeen, called Elaine, was 30. They had a 2-year-old son, Peter, and Elaine was 7 months pregnant with a baby they were planning to name Casey if it was a girl. They lived in a beige and white mobile home off Route 37, rented land from a nearby farming couple. Keith worked as a treatment plant operator at the Rend Lake Water Conservancy District. Elaine worked at an office supply store in Mount Vernon. They were active in a small Baptist church. Keith sang or played guitar, and Elaine played piano. By all accounts, a quiet, ordinary family who were trying to make a life.
And yet Keith had become more anxious about safety. He told his mother Joanne that the area was too violent and that he wanted to move back to Mount Carmel, even if he didn't have a job lined up. There's a specific incident reported where a young woman came to their mobile home asking to use the phone, and Keith wouldn't let her in because he feared a setup. That kind of vigilance is common in communities under stress.
By late 1987, they'd put the trailer up for sale. Small detail, but it figures into several versions of what happened later. Okay, let's walk the timeline. The murders occurred around November 17th and 18th, 1987. On the morning of the 18th, Keith fails to show up for his shift at the Rend Lake treatment plant, which was unlike him. His supervisor tries to call the house repeatedly. No answer. Calls go out to his parents. His father, Don, drives to Ena with a house key and meets deputies.
They enter the trailer that evening. At first glance, the home doesn't look ransacked. There's no obvious forced entry. Then, this is the part that shocked people. Lying together in a bedroom, on a bed, are Elaine, Peter, and the newborn girl, apparently tucked in. Elaine is bound and gagged with duct tape. All three appear to have been beaten to death with a baseball bat, Peter's birthday bat, reportedly a gift from Keith. The coroner later determined Elaine went into premature labor as a result of the beating. The baby was apparently delivered during or immediately after the assault and never given a chance to live. It's incredibly hard to even say aloud.
Yeah, it's devastating. And then this is what compounds the mystery. Keith is missing, and his red 1981 Plymouth is gone. Early suspicion understandably fell on him. Law enforcement even went to arrest him at his mother's home. But the next day, November 19th, hunters found a male body in a wheat field near the Franklin-Jefferson County line, close to Rend Lake College. It was identified as Keith.
Keith's body had been shot 3 times, and his genitals had been severed, mutilated. His car was later found parked outside the police station in Benton, about 11 miles south of the trailer, with blood spatter inside. Coroners estimated that all 4 victims died within roughly an hour of each other. That timing raises questions. Were they all killed in rapid succession? Was Keith taken first and killed elsewhere? Or was he killed and then... Well, there are several possibilities, but investigators never fully resolved the exact sequence.
Right. Early on, with Elaine and the children dead and Keith missing, police treated him as the prime suspect. It delayed the realization of this being a 4-victim homicide, and it added another layer of pain for the family. Keith's parents had to be in the position of both searching for their son and then learning he was a victim. Joanne later on said how much that weighed on them. The scene suggested extreme rage, but there was no robbery, no drugs in the victim's systems, and no obvious sexual assault, according to investigators. Though a small amount of marijuana was found in the trailer, not enough to indicate dealing and possibly belonging to someone else.
That combination, overkill, no robbery, no forced entry, brings up a core profiling question. Is this someone the family knew? Someone who was let in or had reason to be trusted? Or is it a roaming, opportunistic attacker who exploited an unlocked home? The lack of forced entry does suggest the killer was either let in or just happened to find an unlocked door, which is common in rural areas.
And yet, the brutality, especially the newborn being beaten to death, and the mutilation of Keith, adds a symbolic or deeply personal feel to it. But there were no known enemies, no unresolved affairs or gambling debts that investigators could find. Investigators looked into coworkers, neighbors, acquaintances. About 100 people were interviewed. 30 detectives worked the case. Early persons of interest were cleared. The investigation was thorough, but it hit a wall.
Investigators also had to contend with the era. DNA technology in 1987 was rudimentary. By the time forensic DNA matured, there wasn't publicly reported preserved evidence suitable for retesting, or at least none reported that led to a public hit. So the case fell into cold case status, revisited occasionally, but no major breakthroughs.
This is where the name Tommy Lynn Sells enters the narrative. He was a transient, a drifter, born in 1964, who spent much of his life hopping trains, riding with carnivals, moving between states. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, after he was convicted and sentenced to death in Texas for the murder of a 13-year-old, he began confessing to a number of other killings, among them the Dardeen family homicides in southern Illinois.
Sells is a complicated figure. On the one hand, the pattern of his violence, sudden, brutal attacks on strangers, often sexual in nature, fits the Dardeen killings in some ways. On the other hand, Sells was known to give multiple, sometimes conflicting accounts of crimes, and he often sought attention. His confessions have been scrutinized because he's accused of both genuine confession and possible fabrication.
Exactly. He gave several different versions of how the Dardeen murders happened. In one, he met Keith at a truck stop or a pool hall. They went back to the trailer, shared dinner, and then, according to Sells, Keith made a sexual proposition involving Elaine that enraged him. Sells said he forced Keith to drive to a field where he shot and mutilated him, then returned to kill Elaine, Peter, and the newborn.
In another version, he claimed he'd gotten off a freight train, noticed the trailer had a for sale sign, and pretended to be a prospective buyer. That detail, the for sale sign, is interesting because it's accurate. The Dardeens were selling the mobile home. Sells said he took advantage of that to get inside, bound Elaine and Peter with duct tape, forced Keith to the field, killed and mutilated him, then returned to the trailer to rape and beat the others to death with the bat. In yet another account, he skipped interacting with Keith altogether and portrayed it as a more opportunistic attack. The core elements, mutilation of Keith, the baby born during the attack, the use of the child's bat, were present in his confessions, but the sequence and the sexual assault claim varied.
Right, and that's an important caveat. Sells claimed he raped Elaine, but investigators have publicly said there was no clear evidence of rape. There was no confirmation of semen or forensic proof, according to what's been reported. So some of Sells's more sensational claims don't match the public forensic record. That doesn't necessarily prove he didn't have involvement, but it complicates things.
It does. From a criminological perspective, you have to weigh a confession against corroboration. Sells offered specific, grisly details that could indicate first-hand knowledge: the for sale sign, the use of the child's bat, the genital mutilation of Keith. Those are not generalities, but his accounts changed in other respects, and we also know Sells had a habit of claiming responsibility for crimes he didn't commit, sometimes to prolong attention, sometimes because his memory was distorted by substance use and a chaotic life. We can't simply accept his story at face value.
Illinois authorities interviewed him multiple times, but were never able to get him in the state for a full on-site investigation and reenactment. Texas wouldn't transport him. Ultimately, they never charged him in the Dardeen case. Some investigators privately thought he was the most likely perpetrator. Others were unconvinced. Keith's mother, Joanne, expressed doubts publicly. She has said she doesn't fully believe Sells's story and urged that the case remain open.
That position from the family is understandable. The narratives changed. There were factual matches, but also notable mismatches. Without a definitive forensic link, like DNA, or full corroboration from an on-site reenactment or travel records placing Sells reliably in the area on those exact dates, you can't build a prosecutable case. This is a classic cold case problem. You have a compelling suspect and partial matches, but nothing to elevate the confession into a conviction.
So the case stayed unsolved. But the ripple effects were profound. The community had already been traumatized by previous homicides. The Dardeens' murders just ratcheted up a feeling of vulnerability. People started to change how they lived in rural areas, locking doors, sleeping with firearms, avoiding leaving children alone. That's a social cost that often goes underreported in the phone books of crime statistics.
And for the family, Don and Joanne, there was the immediate trauma of finding the home where their daughter-in-law and grandchildren had been killed, the shock of seeing their son treated as a suspect for a time, and then learning he had been found murdered and mutilated. That combination of public suspicion and private grief can leave wounds that never heal. Joanne's insistence that the case remain open reflects a desire for truth and for a complete narrative, something that allows for closure.
Yeah, closure. Such a fraught word. Oftentimes, people want a single answer, a single person to blame, and a sense of finality. But in many cold cases, especially ones involving transient offenders who taunt investigators with confessions, closure is slippery. Let me ask you, Aaron, what do you make of the sexual assault claims in Sells' confessions versus the investigators' public statements that there was no clear evidence of rape?
Good question, Megan. There are a few possibilities. One, Sells could be lying or embellishing, claiming sexual assault to fit his broader pattern or to heighten his role in the crime. Two, there might have been sexual contact that didn't leave traceable forensic evidence, especially if evidence wasn't collected or preserved in ways we now expect. But the public statement from investigators that they didn't find evidence of rape suggests either it wasn't present or evidence couldn't support that claim. Without DNA or corroborating injuries noted on autopsy reports available publicly, it remains an unresolved discrepancy.
And then there's the question of motive. If Sells did it, was it random because the family seemed vulnerable and their door was unlocked? Or was it targeted because Keith may have invited him in, or because Sells had reason to know this family? The for sale sign detail supports the idea of opportunism, but the level of overkill lands us in an area that feels personal.
Family annihilations typically have a motive tied to the perpetrator: revenge, financial problems, mental breakdowns. But in cases where the perpetrator is a stranger, the drifter who lashes out, the violence can look personal because it's intensely overkill inflicted on people who are defenseless. In Sells' known crimes, he often attacked strangers in transient settings. So the Dardeen case could be consistent with a drifter's extreme violence. But the lack of forced entry and some of the specific sequence details sometimes point toward interaction between the killer and the family, which muddies profiling conclusions.
There's also a broader, ethical question we need to talk about when confessions come from notorious serial killers. How should law enforcement weigh a confession from someone like Sells, who is prone to both extreme violence and to fabricating or exaggerating? What are the risks of closing a case based primarily on such a confession?
The risks are significant. First, you could be denying justice by pinning the crime on the wrong person, which leaves the real perpetrator either unpunished or free. Second, it can shake the family's trust in law enforcement if the confession later unravels. Third, it can set a precedent where other offenders confess to multiple crimes and investigators accept it without rigorous corroboration. Best practice, at least in modern investigative standards, is to secure independent corroboration, physical evidence, credible timelines, witness ties, or travel records. Without that, a confession is suggestive but not conclusive.
Yeah. And in this case, the authorities chose not to charge Sells, which I think reflects some caution on their part. Let's step through some of the concrete facts again, because details matter, and they're also part of why people keep coming back to this case. Date: November 17 to 18, 1987. Place: rural area near Ena, Jefferson County, Illinois. Victims: Keith, 29, Elaine, 30, Peter, 2, and the newborn, often called Casey. Causes of death: blunt force trauma from the bat for Elaine, Peter, and the newborn. Keith shot 3 times and mutilated. Crime scene details: no forced entry, no apparent robbery, no drugs or alcohol in victims, small amount of marijuana present. Investigation: around 30 detectives, 100 interviews, no charges. Primary unofficial suspect, Tommy Lynn Sells, who confessed but was never charged. Status, unsolved.
Those are the core touchstones. My sense is that the specific details Sells got right are the ones that give his confession weight. The for sale sign, the baseball bat being the child's bat, the genital mutilation, and the separateness of Keith's body. Those aren't things someone could easily guess. But then you weigh that against inconsistent elements. How he says he met Keith, the sexual assault claim that doesn't match public autopsy statements, and his general unreliability in other confessions.
So the case sits in that frustrating middle ground. For listeners who like timelines and what investigators did, local police, Illinois State Police, and other agencies teamed up quickly and worked diligently. Yet, despite interviewing family, co-workers, neighbors, and more distant acquaintances, the trail went cold. In the late 1980s and 1990s, detectives revisited leads, but no decisive forensic breakthroughs were publicly reported. It's one of those mysteries where everything about the violence screams for an answer, but the evidence, at least publicly available evidence, doesn't give it.
I want to add one more dimension: community memory. Cases like this take on a life beyond the facts. Locals repeat the story, details shift, rumors mutate. That can be a double-edged sword. On one hand, attention keeps the case active and might produce new witnesses. On the other, folklore and inaccurate retellings muddy the record. When a notorious confessor like Sells enters the story, you get even more conflation between verified facts and sensational claims.
Absolutely. I used to cover small-town beats, and I'd watch how stories hardened into local legend. The Dardeen murders are often cited as one of the most disturbing homicides in Illinois history because of the brutality, the newborn victim, and the unresolved nature. It left a visible scar on Ina's identity. People still talk about it. Some avoid Route 37. People never quite forget.
Megan, what do you think investigators might do today if they reopen the case with modern tools? Assuming evidence was retained properly, what could DNA or other forensic advances offer?
If trace evidence was preserved, blood swabs, tape used to bind victims, clothing, modern DNA testing could be decisive. Touch DNA, mitochondrial DNA, and even genetic genealogy have solved cold cases decades old. But the publicly available accounts don't clarify whether such evidence exists in a usable form. If prosecutors and investigators have retained items like the duct tape or any clothing with foreign DNA, then there's potential. But without public confirmation of retained evidence, we can only say the possibility exists, not that it's actually available.
Right, and even when evidence exists, chain of custody issues or contamination can limit utility. But it's encouraging that cold case units today routinely re-examine physical evidence and sometimes resolve decades-old mysteries. For the family, that would be an option worth pursuing, if the evidence is there and the will exists to reopen the investigative notebooks.
Let's pause for a moment. People who listen to a lot of true crime sometimes ask me, why do we focus on cases like this? Why keep telling the story? For me, it's about the people. Keith and Elaine and little Peter and that baby, ordinary lives cut short. It's about the community, shaken, and a mother like Joanne who still wants answers. It's about what the unresolved does to families and regions, the fear, the speculation, the counseling needs, the long aftershocks. Those human costs are why we revisit cold cases.
And from a scholarly view, Unresolved cases teach us about investigative limits, about the psychology of confessors, and about how social context, like the spike in regional crime and the satanic panic of the late 1980s, shapes public perception. It's both a human story and a study in the limits of evidence and memory.
Before we move into listener questions and some of the ethical debates, Aaron, I want to ask you a blunt question. Given everything we've outlined, what's your gut? Did Tommy Lynn Sells kill the Dardeens?
My gut, cautiously stated, is that Sells is a plausible suspect. He had the anatomy of a likely offender, itinerant lifestyle in that era, history of extreme violence, confessions containing some non-public details that match the scene. But I can't say he's the definitive perpetrator because his accounts are inconsistent and there's no public forensic linkage. So, plausible? Yes. Certain? No. That uncertainty is what keeps this case unresolved and keeps people debating.
I agree. Plausible but unproven is where I sit too. It's a painful place to sit when you're talking to surviving family members. Let's talk for a few minutes about the things that people often get wrong when they hear the headlines. 1. That the case was solved. No, officially, it remains unsolved. 2. That investigators rejected Sells out of hand. They didn't. They interviewed him. They just lacked the means to conclusively link him, and Texas's refusal to transport him hampered deeper work. 3. That the brutality must mean a ritual or cult. That's more a product of the satanic panic and rumor than of evidence. Investigators ruled out a ritual element. There were no symbols or ritual signatures.
And 4, that these things always have tidy motives. They don't. Sometimes violence is personal, sometimes it's opportunistic, sometimes it's both in a complicated way. For investigators, it's a grave responsibility to separate rumor from evidence, especially in communities where panic and speculation spread quickly. That careful separation is harder when the crime is as horrific as the Dardeen murders.
Let me ask you another question, Aaron, about the mutilation of Keith's genitals. That's a particularly shocking detail. From a forensic or psychological perspective, what can that kind of mutilation indicate?
Genital mutilation can carry several potential meanings. It can be an expression of rage, a symbolic act intended to humiliate or punish, or part of a perpetrator's personal signature. In some cases, it has sexualized connotations. In others, it's a display of dominance or a way to dehumanize. But we must be careful not to over-symbolize. Without the perpetrator's clear motive or corroborating statements that align consistently with other evidence, the mutilation tells us that the killer intended not just to kill, but to send a violent, degrading message. That much seems clear. What the specific message was, whether personal revenge or something else, remains speculative.
That's helpful. And listeners, that's an important point. We can interpret actions, but interpretation is not the same as proof. Okay, I want to go back to a few smaller, concrete details that kept turning up in Sells' confessions and in media reporting. The baseball bat being Peter's birthday gift, the for sale sign, and the separation of Keith's body from the rest of the crime scene. Those are details that investigators noted and that helped keep Sells on the radar.
Yes, the baseball bat detail is especially chilling. An instrument of play turned into an instrument of death. The for sale sign is the kind of mundane fact a drifter who had been in the area might have seen and then used. And the physical separation, Keith's body in a field, the rest of the family in the trailer, implies either a sequence where he was taken elsewhere or a deliberate choice by the killer to separate the male from the rest. Those are the elements that pull at an investigator's interest because they're specific and not easily guessed by a person who only knew generalities about the killings.
Listeners often ask me, Megan, Did the police mishandle the scene because they originally treated Keith as a suspect? From the source material, the initial treatment as a suspect did delay some perceptions, but the entry into the trailer was lawful. Dawn had a house key, so there's no indication the scene was compromised by that initial mindset. And investigators later ran a broad, multi-agency probe that followed many leads. The challenge was evidentiary, not procedural, in the public record.
Good clarification. Procedural mistakes can and do hamper cases, but in this case, the public information points to a thorough early investigative effort that simply hit the wall of limited forensic options of the era and a lack of corroborating leads.
We've touched on victims and methods and suspects. Let's spend a few minutes on the human side, the mourning, the aftermath, the community therapy, if you will. Dawn and Joanne Dardeen lost their only child and their grandchildren. Joanne later spoke publicly about her heartbreak. Community members needed counseling. Neighborhood routines changed. There's a long tail to this kind of trauma. Anniversaries trigger pain. Every time someone drives by that stretch of Route 37, they might remember. It's in the local memory bank. That matters. It matters as much as forensic analysis.
I want to underline something you said earlier. The focus on killers can eclipse the victims. In a sensational case, the public and media attention often center on the perpetrator, if there is one, and their psychology. But the Dardeens were ordinary people whose lives and routines defined them. Keith sang in church. Elaine played the piano. They planned names for their baby. Those humanizing details are crucial for restoring dignity to the victims and keeping the narrative anchored in those who suffered.
Exactly. We need to keep that front and center. Now, we'll pause for a moment so listeners can let that settle. Okay, when we come back, we'll talk about what would need to happen for this cold case to move toward resolution, and what you, if you're listening and have information, should do. But first, Aaron, one final analytic question. Given the larger pattern of transient serial offenders in the 1980s and 90s, how common is it for a drifter to later claim multiple murders in different states, and how should investigators handle those claims?
Very common, unfortunately. Henry Lee Lucas, Otis Toole, Tommy Lynn Sells, there's a long history of itinerants claiming vast lists of victims. Investigators must be methodical. They need to seek corroboration for each claim, look for non-public details the confessor couldn't reasonably know, and verify timelines through travel records or witnesses placing the suspect in the area. Confessions without corroboration are leads, not conclusions. And investigators should also assess motive for confessing, seeking attention, bargaining for conditions, or psychological reasons. It's painstaking work, but necessary to avoid miscarriages of justice.
Good summary. All right, now practical matters for listeners. If you think you have information about the Dardeen case, law enforcement asks you to contact the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office or Illinois State Police cold case units. Please provide as much detail as you can, dates, observations, anything that might place someone in the area in November 1987. And please, before you post about this online or spread theories, remember the family. Rumor can re-traumatize survivors.
And if you're a law enforcement professional hearing this, I'd reiterate that re-examination of retained physical evidence with modern DNA techniques could be worthwhile, assuming the chain of custody is intact and items were preserved. Even if nothing publicly reported has come from prior retesting, that doesn't mean a new review couldn't turn something up. Cases have been solved decades later by genetic genealogy and trace DNA.
That's the hopeful note here. Science can sometimes deliver answers long after the crime. but it requires both preserved evidence and institutional will. Before we wrap, Aaron, any final reflections? Something you want listeners to carry with them?
2 things. 1, uncertainty can be incredibly painful, but it's also a call to careful investigation. We owe the families careful, evidence-based work, not hasty closure. 2, transience in the late 20th century complicated a lot of investigations. The era's mobility, combined with limited forensic tools at the time, means we have to be open to reanalyzing old evidence with new techniques. Justice can be delayed, but sometimes it's not impossible.
And for me, this case is a reminder of how ordinary lives can be erased in an instant, and how communities carry that wound for decades. Joanne Dardeen's insistence that the case remain open is a moral one. We owe the victims and their loved ones the truth, not a neat story. Thank you, Aaron, for joining me and for your steady analysis.
Thank you, Megan.
Thank you for listening. If you want more on this case, we've included the source materials in the episode notes. The Dardeen family homicides entry on Wikipedia, investigative overviews like morbidology, and reporting that aggregates the local context. We drew only on those sources for this episode. Every fact mentioned here comes from that material. If you're in the ENA region and have memories or information you think might help, please contact the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office. For those who follow the podcast, we'll keep an eye out for any developments, and, as always, we'll bring verified updates as they come. This has been Still Unanswered. I'm Megan Hollis. Good night.
Good night.